My name is April, and I've always been very close to my father, John. When my mother passed away, I was 12 years old, and it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. From that moment, my father became my rock. He was strong, protective, and did everything to take care of me, even though he was grieving as well. For years, it was just the two of us. Life wasn't easy, but somehow we found comfort in each other. I remember how he would always take me out for ice cream on Sunday afternoons, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. Those small things kept us connected. Then, when my father met Claire a few years later, things changed. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed to be exactly what he needed to find a little joy again. At first, I was happy for him. After all, he deserved to be happy after everything he had gone through. I was 17 and understood that grief could be lonely. I didn't think it would be a problem. But as Claire became more settled in our lives, I began to feel a distance forming between my father and me. It wasn't immediate, it was subtle. Small things, like him not being as available for our late night conversations or our Sunday outings being canceled because Claire had other plans. But I tried to ignore it. After all, he deserved to be happy. Deep down, I always felt a bit uncomfortable around her. There was something about Claire that I couldn't put my finger on. It was as if, in some way, she was always watching me, analyzing my reactions, testing my boundaries. I convinced myself it was just silly jealousy, and that I would get used to it over time. But that discomfort never went away. Slowly, my family life stopped being so predictable. Moments that were once filled with laughter and light conversations now had a heavy, awkward air. It was hard to explain, but something was definitely changing. And not in a good way. Little did I know, that was only the beginning. The first changes were small. My father seemed more tired than usual, always ready with an excuse. He said it was work, the stress from the company. Claire, of course, supported that idea. She was always so careful, always offering him some tea or food to help him relax. It was during one of those nights that I began to notice something strange. We were all having dinner, and my father barely touched his food. He seemed exhausted, as if he could hardly keep his eyes open. Claire sat beside him, smiling, insisting he take a medicine she had prepared. She said it would help with the headaches he'd been having. I found it odd my father never complained about headaches. That night, as I helped clean the table, I saw Claire discreetly discard some dried herbs that had been left in the kitchen. They were herbs I had never seen before. When I asked what they were, she just smiled and said they were natural remedies, something to help calm him down. But the way she said it, it felt off, like she was hiding something. From then on, I started to notice a pattern. Whenever my father seemed especially tired or disoriented, Claire was around, offering him something to eat or drink. Sometimes he would just fall asleep on the couch in the middle of the afternoon, something he had never done before. I didn't want to believe anything was wrong. Maybe it was just a phase. Maybe my father really was stressed out and I was imagining things. But the feeling that something was deeply wrong only grew inside me. Claire seemed to always control what he ate, what he drank, and my father trusted her blindly. I tried to push these thoughts away, but every time I looked at my father, weak and distant, a tight knot in my chest told me I needed to pay closer attention. That's when I started to investigate, to watch more carefully what was really happening. It was on an ordinary night when everything started to make sense, and it was terrifying. I was in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes when I heard Claire's voice coming from the living room. She was talking to someone on the phone. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but I could make out a few words. "He's weaker than I imagined. It won't be long now." My body froze. What was she saying? Who was she talking about? I decided to get closer, walking quietly to the entrance of the living room. Claire was sitting on the couch with her back to me, still whispering on the phone. Yes, I know it seems cruel, but it's the only way to make sure everything goes as planned. My knees nearly gave out. She was talking about my father. I didn't know what to do at that moment. My head was spinning. I went back to the kitchen, feeling a cold chill run down my spine, trying to keep calm. I sat down, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I knew I needed concrete proof before making any accusations. My father trusted Claire completely, and if I tried to confront him without something solid, he would never believe me. I was scared, but determined to find out what she was doing. That same night, I waited until everyone was asleep. I knew Claire had a habit of storing certain things in the kitchen cupboard, out of anyone's reach. I walked back there, taking deep breaths to calm myself, and started searching. And that's when I found it. At the back of one of the drawers, among the herbs and natural remedies, there were small bottles with labels I didn't recognize. I grabbed one of them, my hands shaking, and tried to decipher the words on the label. These weren't common medicines, that much I knew. My stomach churned. I ran to my room, clutching the bottle like it was a bomb about to explode. I needed to find out what this was. I needed to be sure of what was happening. I spent hours on the internet, searching for any information that could help me understand what was going on. And that's when I discovered the substances were poisonous in repeated doses. It hit me all at once. Claire was poisoning my father slowly, little by little, without him noticing. My heart shattered. I wanted to scream, to run to his room and tell him everything, but at the same time, I was paralyzed with fear. What would I do now? How could I protect the man I loved most in the world from someone he trusted blindly? I knew that if I wanted to save my father, I would have to be careful. At this point, I will pause the translation. Let me know if you would like to continue from here. My mind was racing, and the fear grew stronger with each passing minute. I couldn't sleep that night, still holding the bottle in my hands. The thought of confronting Claire sent chills down my spine, but the idea of losing my father to that woman was unbearable. But what if I was wrong? What if this was all just a big misunderstanding? I needed to be absolutely sure before I did anything. In the following days, I tried to act normally, but every time I looked at my father, my chest tightened. He was getting weaker and more disoriented. The things Claire prepared for him, I started paying more attention. She always served him a specific tea before bed, something she claimed was calming, but I knew it was part of the plan. And when I tried to convince him to stop eating or drinking anything she prepared, he would just laugh and say Claire was taking care of him, that she only wanted the best for him. And me? I felt powerless. There was one moment, one morning after breakfast, when my father could barely stand. He seemed disoriented, as if he'd had too much to drink, but of course, he hadn't touched alcohol. Claire came rushing over, concerned, saying he needed to rest. She took him to the bedroom, and I just stood there, feeling my stomach churn. The fear consumed me. Every day, he grew weaker, more dependent on her. I kept telling myself I needed to act soon, but the doubt and guilt paralyzed me. What if I confronted Claire and she convinced my father that I was crazy? What if, because of that, I lost him completely? I spent sleepless nights wondering how to act. What could I do to get Claire out of our lives without causing irreparable damage? I had no concrete proof other than that bottle, and even then, how could I prove she was administering it little by little? I knew I was running against time, but every attempt I made to protect my father only pushed him further away from me. He trusted her more than he trusted me. It tore me apart inside. I couldn't just accuse her without evidence, or I would lose any chance of saving him. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to give up. I would do anything to keep him safe, even if he didn't understand, even if it cost me everything. I decided that I had to act, but smartly. Confronting Claire at that moment would be a mistake. I knew she was manipulating my father, and he was becoming increasingly blind to her care. So I opted for a more subtle approach. I began to monitor everything she did. In the mornings when Claire went to the market or the salon, I took the opportunity to examine the house. I searched their bedroom, checked the bathroom, the cabinets. Every detail mattered. The pressure of knowing I was playing against time, and that any slip could be fatal weighed on me. There was no sign of other bottles, but I knew she was being cautious. Claire was smarter than I had imagined. My real opportunity came a few weeks later. My father was worse, barely able to finish meals without feeling dizzy. I offered to make dinner, an attempt to prevent him from consuming anything Claire had prepared. She agreed, perhaps thinking I wasn't a threat. but I was vigilant. When she came into the kitchen to help, I didn't let her near the food. I prepared everything, and while we sat at the table, I watched her closely. She was uneasy. My father was a little better that day, having not consumed anything prepared by her since lunch. I could see Claire's discomfort at noticing that. That night, while she was in the bedroom with my father, I stayed in the kitchen. The jar of herbs she always mixed into his teas was on the counter. My heart raced. I knew I needed to see exactly what she was giving him, so I decided to act. I took a small amount of the tea she prepared and saved it in a bottle to take to the lab. It might seem crazy to some, but I needed proof. I needed to understand what was destroying my father. The next morning, before Claire woke up, I discreetly took the sample for analysis. The days that followed were tormenting. I waited for the lab results while watching my father continue to deteriorate before my eyes. Claire kept poisoning him, and every time he drank the tea, I felt time running out. Finally, the call came. The substances found in the tea were toxic, enough to weaken someone over time, exactly what was happening to my father. My heart pounded as I looked at the report in my hands. It was the confirmation I needed, but at the same time, everything felt more difficult. How was I going to confront Claire without putting my father in danger? With the report in hand, I felt a mix of relief and terror. Now I had proof. Claire was poisoning my father, little by little. But that didn't make things any easier. The confrontation I had feared so much was inevitable, and I knew Claire wasn't someone who would back down easily. Any mistake could be fatal, especially for my father. That night, I returned home late with the report hidden in my bag. Claire was in the living room, pretending to read a book, while my father slept on the couch, paler than ever. She glanced at me briefly, wearing her usual fake smile, but there was something in her eyes, something that made me feel like she knew I was about to act. I wasn't going to wait any longer. I went straight to the bedroom and grabbed the jar she used to prepare the teas, along with the report. My heart was racing. I knew I couldn't do this in front of my father. He wasn't in a condition to hear such an accusation. So I went back to the living room and called her. "Claire, can we talk for a minute?" She followed me to the kitchen, curious. I closed the door behind us, and for a second, my entire body trembled. There was no turning back now. I placed the jar and the report on the table. Her eyes darkened for a brief second, but she quickly resumed that calm, manipulative demeanor I hated so much. "What is this, April?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and false innocence. "You know exactly what it is," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I had an analysis done on the things you were putting in my father's teas. This is poison, Claire. You've been killing him slowly." For a moment, her face was expressionless. Then she let out a soft laugh, as if I were telling a joke. "Poison? April, that's ridiculous. I'm only trying to help your father. These are natural remedies. He's sick, and you're making these things up out of jealousy." Rage rose to my throat. "This isn't jealousy. Don't play dumb. I know what you're doing. You want his inheritance. And if you think I'm going to stand by while you destroy him, you're very wrong." She stepped closer, too close for my comfort, and her smile disappeared completely. Her face twisted into something cold and cruel. "You're so naive, April. He's never going to believe you. I'm his wife. He loves me. He trusts me. And you're just a spoiled little girl who can't handle not being the center of attention anymore." My stomach turned, but I didn't back down. "I have the proof. If you don't stop, I'll go to the police. This is a crime, Claire. You won't get away with it." She stared at me in silence for a long time, her eyes burning with hatred. I knew she was calculating her next move, but I wasn't going to back down. "Not this time." "Fine, April," she finally said, her voice lower, more menacing. "Let's see who he chooses to believe." And with that, she walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone, trembling with fear. I knew the real battle was just beginning. The morning after our confrontation, my father was worse. He could barely get out of bed, weaker than I had ever seen him. Claire, of course, was there beside him, taking care of everything, acting like the devoted wife who only wanted the best for him. Her performance was impeccable. I tried talking to him, tried convincing him that something was wrong, but he could barely pay attention to me. April, he murmured, his voice tired. Stop worrying so much. Claire is taking care of me. You need to trust her. Every word cut into my heart. I looked at Claire, who shot me a triumphant look. She knew my father was completely under her control, that any attempt I made to alert him would be useless as long as he was so frail. The rage I felt mixed with the despair. I was losing him, and the worst part was that he couldn't see it. Desperate, I made a decision. I needed to tell him everything, even if he didn't believe me. So that afternoon, when Claire left to get some natural remedies, which I knew were part of the poison, I sat next to him. He was lying down, his eyes closed, breathing heavily. Dad, we need to talk, I said, feeling my voice catch in my throat. He opened his eyes slowly, looking at me with a mixture of exhaustion and concern. April, not now. I'm so tired. Please, Dad, this is important. It's about Claire. I pulled the report from my pocket and placed it in his trembling hands. She's poisoning you. I found out what she's been putting in your teas, and I had it analyzed. It's killing you slowly. He blinked, confused, trying to process what I was saying. What are you talking about? Dad, I know this is hard to believe, but I have proof. I'm not making this up, I swear. Claire is poisoning you to get your inheritance. She's manipulating you, and you can't see it because you're too weak to notice. He looked at the report in his hands, but his eyes seemed vacant. He shook his head slowly. That can't be true, April. Claire, she takes care of me. She's with me all the time. You must be mistaken. I felt a deep pain seeing how deluded he was. Dad, please trust me. I know you don't want to believe it, but you have to. If you don't do something now, there won't be much time. I'm going to lose you. He closed his eyes, exhausted, and remained silent for a long time. I didn't know if he was considering what I had said or simply ignoring me. When he finally opened his eyes again, his expression was weary, as if the weight of reality was starting to sink in. I don't know what to think. April. Before I could say anything else, we heard the front door open. Claire was back. His expression changed instantly, returning to that same state of confusion and dependence. He looked at me almost apologetically with his eyes. I need to rest. I left the room feeling like I had failed. Even with the proof in my hands, my father was so weak, so blinded by the control Claire had over him, that he couldn't react. Claire entered the room shortly after, giving me a sharp look, as if she knew exactly what I had done. She didn't say anything, but the silence between us was suffocating. I knew the situation was reaching a breaking point. Something big needed to happen to break him free from the emotional prison Claire had built around him. And I had to be ready because I knew Claire wouldn't give up easily. The truth was on the verge of being revealed, and the price of that revelation would be high for both me and my father. In the days that followed, the tension in the house was unbearable. Claire knew I was fighting against her, and every time our eyes met, I felt the weight of her threat. But she still acted like she was in control, and my father, weaker every day, seemed incapable of understanding what was happening around him. It was on a Sunday afternoon that everything fell apart. My father was in the bedroom, almost unconscious. Claire insisted that he take one more dose of that damn tea, and it was at that moment that I realized I couldn't wait any longer. If I didn't act, she would finish what she had started. So in a burst of impulse, I walked into the room and grabbed the cup from her hands, spilling the liquid onto the floor. Enough. You're not giving him anything else, I shouted, my voice filled with a desperation I could barely control. Claire glared at me, furious. What do you think you're doing, April? Are you trying to kill your own father by stopping him from getting care? I know what you're doing. I showed her the jar she had been using to poison him and threw it onto the bed, next to my father. He's like this because of you. You're poisoning him, and I won't let you continue. The shock on my father's face was obvious. He was confused, but the fear in his eyes told me that, for the first time, he was beginning to doubt Claire. She tried to maintain control of the situation, but I knew the end was near. You're crazy, April, she said, but this time the confidence in her voice wavered. You're making up these lies because you can't stand your father having someone other than you I took a deep breath and looked her straight in the eye. I had an analysis done on what you've been putting in his teas. The substances are toxic. Claire, poison. I've already gone to the police, and they're just waiting for my father's confirmation to act. The truth hit like a blow. Claire took a step back, her face completely pale. You went to the police? She tried to laugh, but the nervousness was palpable. You don't have any proof. I have the report, I have the jar, and now I have my father here, hearing everything. Claire looked at him, panicking. My father, finally realizing something terrible was happening, struggled to sit up in bed. Claire, what? What is all this? She froze. For the first time, the control she had over him was crumbling. I stepped closer and held his hand. Dad, you need to trust me now. She's been poisoning you. I have all the evidence. We can't let her hurt you anymore. Claire took a few steps back, desperately looking for an escape, but there was nowhere left to run. She knew she was cornered. I was just trying to help. He was going to leave me anyway. So, I thought. Before she could finish, my father broke down in tears. The trust, the faith he had in her, it all shattered in an instant. Watching it was devastating for me. 2. Even though I had saved him, the pain of discovering the betrayal of the person he loved was unbearable for him. With no other way out, Claire ran out of the house, leaving us alone in the room. I sat beside him, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. He was safe, yes, but the emotional destruction that had been caused, I didn't know if he would ever fully recover. I held his hand as he cried, realizing that the person he had trusted so completely had tried to destroy him. That night, we called the police and Claire was arrested. The process that followed was painful, but fair. My father finally understood the extent of what she had done, and there was no way for her to escape the truth. Today, months later, my father is recovering, not only physically, but emotionally as well. He still carries the scars of what happened, but we are rebuilding our lives together. And although this experience destroyed much of who he was, it also brought us closer in a way I never thought possible. I've learned the hard way that love isn't always blind. Sometimes, it just needs a light to see the truth.
Hi, you are on the Moving Narratives channel. Subscribe and follow our stories.